From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
I'm Chris Beem.
I'm Candis Watts Smith.
I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. Great to be here with all three of you together, and we're going to take a look back at some of what's happened recently, as well as some of what's to come here over the summer while we'll be away. And we're going to do that by looking back at some of our previous episodes. The nice thing about having 200 and some odd episodes is that we've talked about a lot of things that continue to be topics in the news, and a lot of our guests have provided useful insights that can help us frame what we're seeing now and will continue to see in the future. So we've got a couple of different topics here that we'll go through, and we want to start with a thing that I think was on all of our minds and really dominated the news for much of the spring, which was protests about the war in Gaza happening at universities. And our colleague at Penn State, Vivian, has recently written a lot about these protests and how they're portrayed in the media and elsewhere. But before that, we had him on the show to talk about his book, Campus Misinformation, which I think gets at a deeper issue that these protests may manifest about the idea of free speech on campus and what that means versus how it's portrayed. And so let's, as a way to set the stage here, let's take a listen to this clip from Brad.
I understand there's a kind of cultural politics which is attacking universities now because universities are supposedly kind of elitist and out of touch. I think there's a great amount of that goes on in universities across social and political perspectives. That's my sort of colloquial take. But I also think that is misinformation to the extent that if you look at student bodies and who's going to universities these days, lots of people from many different socioeconomic classes. So the student body is much more democratic in that respect than it used to be, not culturally elite, even at traditionally elite institutions. And I think that's something we should appreciate and listen to them and consider their experience as part of the process of building a more democratic higher education infrastructure.
Hopefully that's jogged your memory. And if that is of interest to you, you can go back and listen to that whole episode with Brad. I'll put it in the show notes. But I wonder, for all of you, do you think that the discourse that we saw throughout much of April and May about the Gaza protests fits into this narrative about campus misinformation, that campuses are out of control, that there's no longer free speech? Or was this perhaps something different? So Candis, why don't we start with you on this one? What did you see at Duke, and how do you think about that as it pertains to the argument that Brad's making?
I guess one of the things that comes to my mind, generally speaking, is the question of whether there has ever been a time when college students protested anything and students themselves were not attacked as being outside of the boundaries of the acceptable. And I mean, that could be civil rights, that could be Vietnam, that could be Black Lives Matter, kind of anti-war protests after 9/11, even kind of when students were doing protests for labor rights for the folks that are working on their campuses in janitorial or, in the cafeteria and things like that. So I'm always a little reticent to, I find the kind of pattern striking because, students can protest, I was going to say climate change, but I guess that's also controversial. I'm trying to think of something that's not controversial, that if college students did decide to protest it, if people wouldn't then suggest that they were out of control or that it was just another signal that universities are indoctrinating students, which I always also find really interesting because we can't even get our students to read our syllabus. So I guess, generally speaking, I find that this response to students, the context is certainly different, but the response, it's so familiar. And almost it's disheartening because it doesn't feel, because the response is so typical, it doesn't feel like we're having an actual critical conversation about the nuances of either what students are doing and or what they are protesting for or against.
Protests do not lend themselves to nuance, right? I mean, they are a response that is, by design, black and white. And, anybody who knows anything about this conflict and especially this current iteration knows that there's nothing but gray here. And so I don't know how possible that is. I think Brad is a smart and thoughtful guy, and he and I have had several, discussions, arguments about this. I do think that, there's pretty good evidence that this is mostly, not to say exclusively, but mostly taking place in the most elite colleges in the United States. And so that does reinforce this argument that there is this kind of privileged and elite process that's going on among universities that's detached, disconnected from, the real world and from what most people think about in terms of morality. Very similar to the president's hearing before Congress. But, I don't know. I thought Biden's reaction was just right. Protest is not only legitimate, it is, worthy as part of a democratic society. But there are limits, and there are limits that are appropriate. And if you want to go against those, if you want to break the law, you have that right as well. But if you're going to do that, Martin Luther King said, you break the law lovingly. You accept the consequences.
To take Brad's concerns seriously, his argument, I think, holds really quite well here. He's saying that there's this sort of narrative out there that campuses are out of control, that things are widespread, that free speech is really threatened. And it has attracted a great deal of attention in the national media. Obviously, Republicans in the House have climbed all over it as a way for them to quite opportunistically attack universities. But, building on what Chris said, I've seen a quantitative analysis of this as well from data that Harvard's collected. These encampments are almost exclusively at the most elite schools, defined by schools that have the most selective acceptance rates, that have the fewest number of students on Pell Grants, that have the highest tuition. This is very much occurring at a small number of schools among quite privileged students in media capitals in New York, in Washington, and Los Angeles, and attracting an enormous amount of attention. I also do think, though, that we ought to take seriously the form of the protests, and I think there is something different about them. And I thought the president of the University of Chicago nailed it quite well. And I mean, in Chicago really being the place that everyone looks to understand how a campus best approaches free speech. And what he said very clearly was, you have the perfect right to do this. And I'm not saying that you don't have the right to do it, but consider what it is that you're doing. Consider, he said, that an encampment with all its etymological connections to the word to military origins is a way of using force of a kind rather than reason to persuade others. And there has been something extremely threatening and intimidating about many of these protests. What I look at is not necessarily the encampments, which is what he was looking at. I find the masking to be extremely unsettling and intimidating on campus. I don't really know where hiding your identity on campus, other than for medical reasons, but this isn't for medical reasons, where hiding your identity in the community of the university is suddenly an acceptable thing to do. It is an intimidating feeling to see that. And the encampments themselves. And, I do think also that this is pushing up against some of the free speech issues that Brad has talked about, because it's clear that universities have had a very difficult time, because these are very difficult questions about figuring out what's acceptable and what's not. And for that matter, who gets to define anti-Semitism? I mean, so a lot of Jews on campus say, that's anti-Semitic when you talk about global intifada or when you talk about from river to the sea. But people that say it, I'll say, I don't mean anything anti-Semitic by that at all. Keep in mind, these are small numbers of students. And even on the campuses where it's occurring, it's small number of students. But, as Brad well points out, that gets blown way out of proportion to what's really going on.
So, Michael, you hit on something there about the pressure that universities are facing from Congress. We've seen the presidents of several Ivy League universities either step down or be forced to step down or kind of on the verge of having to resign, in part because of pressure from Congress, which is fueled by the media. It's this sort of vicious cycle that Brad talks about. And Brad's counter to that is, universities should be doing more to communicate the democratic work that they do at all kinds of places, both inside and outside of the classroom. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about how much more easier said than done that is, I guess might be the best way to phrase it, or if there are ways that universities can be pushing back against some of the media narratives that are out there about the, air quotes, what's happening on campuses. Not certainly about protests, but maybe also more broadly than that.
I have one quick thought on that, and then I watched the hearings when they brought in the superintendents and principals of public schools around the country. And they were brilliant. They were absolutely brilliant. And part of it is because they really know how to work with conflict. And I thought they did a beautiful job of talking about how they, for example, try to work with students who say things that are inappropriate and hurtful to others, and how they try to navigate these conflicts within their schools. And they didn't take anything from members of Congress who were trying to demagogue them. It was like, we know. We've been in the public eye for a long time. Let's say the superintendent of the Los Angeles schools or the superintendent of the New York schools, but these college presidents, I don't know. I was really struck by just how bad they were at making the case for what their universities are doing well. So I don't know.
But I would say, generally speaking, and maybe I'm speaking at this point as a college administrator, is that I find that universities are largely in a defensive crouch, and it's actually quite annoying. Universities they're great targets, and they're targets of the left and the right, institutions that produce debt, that don't have good ROIs, that aren't paying their fair share in the proportion to their endowments, that are places of indoctrination, on and on, right? And I find it really fascinating that university leaders aren't being more upfront about their potential for democracy in educating citizens to think critically, that we train the next leaders. And, I'm at a elite place where many of my students, they hang out at the Supreme Court for internships, and they are in the White House, and they're on the Hill, and they're in their state legislators, and they're going to be the CEOs of, all of the things. And they are also going to be scientists who discover the next important cure for cancer or climate change or whatever. And so I find it fascinating that that universities aren't taking a kind of more proactive stance and saying, we understand what we owe to democracy, and that we also do the work of enhancing democracy through the way that we train critical thinking, that we make sure that when people say that they want to do their own research, that they actually know what they're doing, and that they're not just kind of people who are following along, but are thinking critically about what it is that we should be doing, that they're paying attention to the news and the fact that we have a sitting president who's being, that is making, a former president that is, sitting in a courtroom because, he paid off, his mistress, right? I mean, and sexually harassed people and, lied about what his all of the things, right? Like the idea here is that we, universities do the work of making sure that the people that they graduate are at least being able to ask questions, whether they be in politics, in economics, in science, right, with the goal of, shifting us towards it at least potentially shifting us toward discovering truer truths.
Yeah. Well, speaking of people maybe not following the news as closely as they should, or teaching students the value of being engaged and informed citizens in our democracy, we have seen some polling recently to suggest that Donald Trump has a lead among voters who self-described do not closely follow politics. And there's been some writing about this as well. I'll link to some articles from the New York Times in the show notes. But this is the divide that at the beginning of this season, we kicked off with an interview with Yanna Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan, two scholars at the University of Michigan who have a book called The Other Divide, which is all about this idea of how closely people follow politics. And I think at the time we all maybe struggled a little bit to get our minds around that argument. It was maybe just a little ahead of its time, or we're seeing it play out here now. Just to refresh your memory, let's take a quick listen to this clip.
You see on the news and you see these really, really political voices. You start to think to yourself, oh, this is what engaging in politics looks like. Those voices also often happen to care a lot about their particular political position. And so politics becomes overwhelming. It becomes something that's uncomfortable. And it becomes something that over time you don't necessarily want to engage with. But for people who aren't deeply involved, there's a tremendous amount of skepticism. They think that people are just posting about politics and just talking about politics because they want to be right, because they want to share their political opinion. Because they want to persuade someone. And I think that kind of emulates this idea of people disengaging from politics in part because they don't necessarily think there's space for them there.
So as we think about this divide, maybe we'll start with you on this one, Michael. Is this the first time that we're seeing something like this manifest, where support for candidates is different based on how closely they're following politics, and what does that say to you about the health of our democracy more broadly, if people feel like they can't see themselves or can't see a place for themselves in what they're following or not?
So, the takeaway from what we're seeing in some of these polls, which is not exactly the question you asked me, but I'm hoping maybe Candis knows about this having shown up in the past a lot, but that this is what gives Biden hope because these people who are largely disengaged are the least likely people to vote. And so getting them out that's going to be Donald Trump's challenge. But clearly, there are a lot of people out there who are just not paying any attention to anything. It comes up a lot with the trial that today has entered into deliberations where, I know what's going on in the trial. I pay quite a bit of attention to it, actually. I love trials. I pay attention to lots of different trials, but I'm struck by how many people I know who don't know a thing about what's going on with that trial, what it's about, how far along it is, or, what it means for Donald Trump. And more generally, I think about my students a bit, sometimes my younger students in particular, who have known nothing in politics except Trump. And, Trump defines what it means to be a president for them. And then Biden, who's just old, but Trump is still out there, kind of still a president, actually, in his own sort of weird kind of warped way down in Mar-a-Lago. Disengagement seems like almost a reasonable adaptation to what's really a kind of ugly and uninspiring space right now, which is our politics.
Well, to your last point, I think that this is the kind of election that gives democracy a bad name. And I think that's what young people are perceiving. Like, is this what people fought for? Right. Is this why, beautifully dressed kids got hosed down by fire hoses and police dogs so that we can relitigate something that happened 4 years ago, and that the other guy who lost, who refuses to say that he did, is still looming large. I think you're right. I think, how do I say? I mean, reasonable. Maybe I wouldn't use the word reasonable, but I would use the word understandable.
Yeah.
I think that even, I as the kids say, like, this is very mid, right? It's very meh. And it's like, what is there to get excited about, and what information can we get? The fact that, the Democratic primaries were really non-existent, and like, maybe you want to learn about RFK. Like, I don't know. If this is what people fought for, I can see why people are unengaged, are disengaged. And the fact of the matter is, what worries me is that this kind of sentiment is very hard to dig out of, right? Like, disengagement and mistrust of our systems are very hard, right? Those are, or let's say engagement and trust are like currency. Yeah. And if you have a debt, right, how long does it take for you to fill up that piggy bank where, people want to get engaged in future? I think this situation is very bad. I mean, I do think that Trump as a candidate is not good. But also, I think that there is something to be said that Biden said that he would be a transitional president.
Yeah. And he lied.
And now here we are. And so I think that there's something to be said about, you said that you would do a thing and you didn't do it. And now here we are. And so I guess that's the other part about the mistrust, right? Like, we have the issues with the Electoral College, and we have the issues about turnout, and we have the issues about voting rights. And now we have also a person who said that they would step aside, and they did not.
I can certainly understand that feeling. And, if you're looking for some kind of high moral standard in politics, you're going to have a long wait. But if you are going to call this a meh election, I'm going to tell you, I think you're out of your mind. This is what I quoted. This is from Steve Bannon a few days ago, talking about Heritage Foundation's 2025 plan. Said the DOJ is completely corrupt from top to bottom. It's going to have to be purged. And the FBI is American Gestapo. As institutions now worthy of going forward, they're going to have to be totally restructured. Now, what do we think the chances are that he will, that if Trump is reelected, he'll follow through with that? 5%, 10%?
I do not disagree that the outcome of this election is absolutely critical. What I'm saying is that for people who are looking at what's going on in the world as unengaged as they already are, and that they don't feel like they feel like they're getting this old guy who said he would do a thing, and that they are under the impression that, that things are going poorly, in part because we didn't have primary debates where people could talk about all of the good things that are happening. At least on the Republican side, you had Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley and DeSantis saying all of these things and completely misinforming people, but at least people were engaged. And now they're like using that misinformation to galvanize behind Trump. I mean, there is a role in which the parties themselves have a role in engaging the public and informing the public about the ramifications of going one way or the other. And we didn't get that. And that's where I think people I can understand where people are coming from. Whether Trump or Biden gets elected will make a huge difference for the future of everybody and everything. And I don't feel like I'm being over exaggerating on that point. But what I'm saying is that this run up here feels very like that, like people don't actually matter, and bringing like real choice from which to elect someone that you are excited about.
I could stipulate, Candis, everything you said, and then just say, and therefore what? You have a choice, two choices, one or the other. And if you
But
are
that's not
willing
how-
to take all that, which is absolutely true, and say that therefore, it's just not speaking to me, or I'm disheartened and disaffected by all this, then I think that is deeply irresponsible. And I don't have any patience for it. We cannot escape history, and that's a choice in front of us. Suck it up and do the right thing.
I also think this idea that the economy is tremendous and everybody should just realize it, it's not. And young people in particular are really feeling it. Okay. They can't buy houses. They can't buy cars. Finding jobs, even though there seems to be a very low unemployment rate, does not seem to be as easy as it's being explained to be. And there's a general feeling of, and I think this is how the super elevation of the campus protests just play into this idea of a country in disorder and distress, which I think is BS, but that's what helps to play into all of that sense. But I don't know. I think Biden makes a mistake because he's always gone around the country saying, oh, we have the best economy in the world. Yes, we've pulled out of COVID better than any of the other G7 countries have. That's clearly the case. But interest rates are high. And inflation for things that really hit certain people, inflation for services is still high. Inflation for hotel rooms is still high. Inflation on travel is still high. And people feel it, and they're not happy about it. Not at all.
So one more point I want to get to here, and it touches on something you were talking about earlier, Candis, about the value that debates have to bring attention and awareness to what's going on and maybe get people who are marginally engaged a little bit more tuned in to what's happening. At least historically, they have been the one thing that kind of breaks through to the mainstream or breaks through to different media silos, as it were. And we will have two presidential debates, one in June and the other one is in September, I believe. So earlier than they had been. And we actually did an episode about this back in 2022, either right before or right after the midterms, when at the time, Ronna McDaniel, the head of the RNC, said that the party would not commit to presidential debates in the next cycle. That has since changed. Of course, Ronna McDaniel is no longer there. But at the time, we talked with John Hudak at Brookings, who wrote about this and the value of debates for democracy. So let's just take a quick step back to what things looked like at that time.
The vast majority of Americans do not make up their mind about who to vote for president based on a presidential debate. That said, I think some people's minds are changed. I think, it's hard for me as someone who I think most people would accuse as being a political elite to look at a choice like Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, or Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or Joe Biden and, name any of the Republicans, Ted Cruz, and not immediately know who you like who's closer to you politically. I mean, they're just such obviously different choices. For me, it's hard to imagine, but for some people, that's the case. Maybe I don't love Donald Trump. Maybe I also don't love Joe Biden, but I know one of these guys is going to have to lead the country. So let me hear what they have to say, and then I'll make up my mind. And when you look at the presidential election in 2016, where if you change, is it like 48,000 votes in 3 states, Hillary Clinton wins the Electoral College. In 2020, if you change like 76,000 votes across 3 states, Donald Trump wins the Electoral College in 2020. So, presidential elections are decided very much at the margins. And could I believe that a presidential debate changes the minds of 77,000 voters out of, 150 million cast, 160 million cast? Absolutely, I do. And so the debates aren't there for you or me, who probably have very entrenched, firm political views and views of candidates. It's there for those marginal voters who, think about politics 24 hours a day, who don't get committed to a candidate early on, and who legitimately wants to hear what those views are. And most importantly, I think, see what that person is like in a situation like that, and not, as I wrote in my piece, in this protected bubble that presidential candidates and presidents operate in at all times during a presidential campaign, except those 3 nights that they're on the debate stage with their opponent.
So, guys, when we recorded this episode with John, it seemed pretty certain that the debates weren't going to happen. I guess maybe, Chris, we'll start with you on this one. Given where we were 2 years ago, are you surprised that we're having debates in the first place, given the stance that the RNC had taken as little as a year or two ago?
Well, I'm not at all confident that we're going to have those debates. I'm actually, if I was going to bet, I would say that Trump is going to find a reason to, bow out. He is not good in places where he cannot control the narrative. And, he lost those debates to Biden. And so I would not be shocked if it doesn't happen at all. If, I am deeply anxious about how this is yet another norm of American democracy that is being manipulated and denigrated by, especially those on the right. And I think that has consequences that extend long beyond whether these debates happen. It's just, reestablishing norms and standards for elections and for politics in general is extremely difficult to do. And we seem to be not only letting it happen, but we're letting Donald Trump, who is indifferent to norms, drive that train. And so I think it is a bad thing. And if those debates were to happen, I think that would be better for American democracy.
Like Chris, I don't actually think these are going to happen. I think it's all sort of a game. But I also, I tread a little bit carefully about this being a great norm of our democracy. These debates in this form have been around, I think, since the debate commission is 1974, maybe. So, yeah, they weren't the same. They certainly weren't with this kind of visibility, and they weren't on TV. And they weren't structured by this debate commission, which, the Republicans have pretty much eliminated, and that Biden apparently is not operating under either.
Well, one thing that John said that really just kind of was just a good reminder is that, if 50,000 people had made a different choice in 2016 or 77,000 in 2020, that's like 0.03% or 0.05% of the total votes cast in those years. And that if indeed finally getting these two, if they happen, or if there's just news around why one didn't show up, I don't know, gets people engaged. And if it influences how they're going to decide, then I don't know. That statistic just stands out to me just so poignantly, but it could also mean that people decide that they don't want to vote either. And so, and those people deciding that they're not going to turn out also makes a big difference. And so I think there's something to be said about, I don't know, I'm sure if we talked about this tomorrow, I would give a different answer, but I do think that there's something to giving semblance to the idea that this is an actual election. And that moving even just through the motions of the norms of how we're supposed to behave in a democracy, where we're supposed to see candidates talk about their ideas and their policies, or at least show the public who they are and what they think. I think all of those things do matter.
Well, we are going to leave things there. If you have thoughts on episodes or people you'd like to hear us talk to in the next season, please get in touch. The summer is my time to plan a lot of the episodes and guests that we have for the next coming fall. So please send us an email or drop us a line if you have suggestions or thoughts. Just wanted to say thank you again to Michael, Candis, and Chris, and to our partners at WPSU for making Democracy Works happen. And for the entire team, I'm Jenna Spinelli. Thanks for listening. Democracy Works is a collaboration between the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU, Public Media for Central and Northern Pennsylvania. Our producer is Andy Grant, and our editors are Mickey Klein, Chris Kugler, Mark Stitzer, and Clint Yoder. Editorial review by Emily Reddy, and additional support from Christine Allen. Democracy Works is a proud member of the Democracy Group, a podcast network focused on democracy, civic engagement, and civil discourse. Learn more about the network at democracygroup.org. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.